It's time for Trench Talk, for your weekly infusion of metal and otherwise heavy music. I'm your host, Flight of Icarus from MetalTrenches.com. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. Today I have many thoughts on a big release, but please do stick around to the end because I'm going to shout out a few underground bands, as is my focus here. Bring in plenty of eyes and ears with a major label act, and hope they stick around to enjoy some other things. But in any case, we're going to talk about Italian symphonic death metal band Fleshgod Apocalypse with their fifth album, Veleno, which is Italian for Venom. Formed in 2007, they had much more of a tech death approach in the beginning, very guitar-oriented with a more traditional sound, but 2011's Agony is when the band really started turning heads with their now trademark bombastic orchestral approach. With woodwinds, brass, strings, percussion, and a love of Beethoven and Bach, they strove for a much more grand and epic sound. Says Fleshgod Apocalypse's multi-instrumentalist Francesco Paoli, Veleno is the most spontaneous album we've ever done. We've always been super honest with our music, but being honest doesn't mean you are completely spontaneous. For instance, we'd never recorded a single note without being 100% sure it was the right one to our ears. But letting your inspiration flow freely without any kind of time, schedule, sound, lineup, restriction is totally another story. I mean, we definitely experimented with some songs in the past, but sometimes it's almost like you feel the need to censor yourself, so to speak. Some days you come up with a really great idea, but for some reason you think it's too much for your music and you toss it away. So the lack of limits, full experimentation, an unavoidable process of rediscovering our roots, all of this led to the most beautiful music we've ever produced. I'm sure people will love Veleno as much as we do. Interesting note, the album was recorded in two distinct phases. The quote-unquote metal part, as they put it, was recorded in Rome at Bloom Recording Studio and Kick Studio with long-standing collaborator Marco Mastrobuono, while the orchestral part was tracked at Musica Tecla Studio in Perugia, the entire production of Veleno taking about 3 months. It's also worth noting that there were some lineup changes between Veleno and the previous album King. Guitarist-vocalists Cristiano Trionfera and Tommaso Riccardi, both of whom have been around since before the Mafia EP, left the group in 2017 for personal reasons. This led to Paoli jumping from the drums to vocalist-guitarist, David Fulcito of Stormlord taking over the kit, and Fabio Bartoletti of Deceptionist filling the second guitar opening. And honestly, I find it funny that it's the guitarist that we lost, because I agree 100% with a comment I saw on the lead single that this sounds more like the band's earlier guitar work. It's like they drew from their more technical roots, but then combined it with that more modern symphonic approach that they've developed over the years. And I've got to tell you, this is what I've been wanting all along. It's like they finally heard my pleas, because in past listens and past reviews I've done with Fleshgod, the thing that really stuck out to me is that they felt like a band that was just criminally underutilizing some very talented axemen, wasting them on just sort of mindless chugging palm mutes and endless tremolos. So finally now on Veleno, we really get to hear the riffs shine. And Fury sets this tone nicely from the very start with plenty of really great hooks, and then Carnivorous Lamb delivers a particularly awesome tech death breakdown somewhere in the middle. And while this change is definitely in part due to an overall increased focus on the guitars in the songwriting process, we also need to pay credit to the continued shifts in production over the last few years. Because in the past, Fleshgod's albums, especially among reviewers I've talked with, have been known by many a listener for sounding downright overbearing at times. It's almost like having your face wailed on with a 2x4 for an hour. That first 5 to 10 minutes is sure to inflict some serious pain, but once you go unconscious, it kind of becomes redundant. As a result, songs often devolved into kind of amorphous blobs that were also somewhat interchangeable. And now, don't get me wrong, I really love Agony and Labyrinth, especially with the subwoofer turned up and the windows rolled down while I'm speeding down the highway or just pulling up to somebody at a stoplight to get some interesting looks. But you have to admit that the bass is way overblown, and much of the mix is overtaken by a seriously muddled combination of really flubby sounding guitar tremolo and endless double bass. Major kind of loudness wars stuff going on. It's overly compressed and overly amplified stuff. And the more I thought about it, the more I started thinking about it in terms of a painting. It's like all this time Fleshgod Apocalypse had been trying to recreate Georges Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte. It's that famous pointillism painting from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and if you don't get that reference, you're clearly much younger than me and your parents have failed you, so get on that. But anyways, for years they've been trying to work in this intricate, detailed style, but using watercolors. And without the proper materials, the colors all start to bleed into one another and it just becomes a mess. Pointillism, which, again, if you don't know what that is, it's the paintings that are made up of many, many little dots. It demands oil paint for its higher viscosity. The paint will stay put and allow each point to differentiate itself. Now, it was on 2016's King that the band finally seemed to find the right tools here in this respect, opening the door to a huge increase in dynamics. At this point, we could finally hear the guitars, but they still weren't really doing much compared to the other instruments. The album's often slower, more subdued approach, especially on tracks like Cold as Perfection and Syphilis, seemed to focus on creating more of sort of a musical or opera experience that really focused on a range of classical directions. It was a shift that took some getting used to, but ultimately I respected, and it ended up being a clear stepping stone to what we are hearing now. And now that Fleshgod have had some time to mature within this improved production style, Veleno largely brings us the best of both worlds. We get more of the speed and bombastic elements of Labyrinth and Agony, the broader dynamic range of King, and guitars that really get to shine as in the days of Mafia. It feels like actually a truly joint effort, with each instrument given plenty of room to breathe. And Sugar is a prime example of this. There are so many elements in this song to keep track of, from the rapid pacing of the drums and guitars to the pianos and synth, and instead of getting lost, they all come together to form a cohesive composition that is greater than the sum of its parts, but again allows each individual instrument to really stand out in the mix. As a result, we get some really excellent moments, with tons of guitar solos, more than I believe they've ever had on a single album, but also some really nice stuff from the other instruments too. In fact, there's some really standout bass lines scattered throughout the likes of Fury, Worship and Forget, and Embrace the Oblivion. The detuned, clanky tone always kicks up the aggression another notch. It sounds like a Panzer tank rolling through a war zone. There are also some excellent female operatic moments on this album, most notably on The Day Will Be Gone. This one is more of a traditional opera track that just happens to have some harsh vocals in it, similar to some songs that were found on King, and also similar to something you might hear on like a Cradle of Filth album, but would go over just fine on Broadway. It's got quite a range to it. Honestly, I think it would be even better without the harsh vocals, as they kind of distract from the classical elements, which I think stand plenty tall on their own. And the timing of this track in the listing really sets the stage for the epic closer, Embrace the Oblivion. This one covers a lot of ground with its many ups and downs and progressive song structure. It's also the longest song on the album at 7.5 minutes, but doesn't at all feel its time. The shifting pacing and textures make it fly by. And speaking of which, I was surprised to look up and see that the album is nearly an hour long, as it never feels that way to me. By the end, I'm always ready to start it up again. In terms of critiques, it's still not a completely perfect album. I'm still kind of on the fence about Mona Lisa's intro. For one, the spoken vocals come across as a little corny, a little cliche. It took me a minute to realize what they reminded me of, but the more I thought about it, it has kind of a Rammstein vibe to it. And kind of once that clicked, I guess I was okay with it because I am a Rammstein fan. I will say also that it builds up nicely, beginning around the midpoint with some really great choral elements, and again, the female operatic vocals. There's a huge guitar solo, and so it's one that definitely builds, from a really low point to this massive peak. And while I love the female clean vocals, the male operatic parts feel a bit strained this time around. There are notes that they could hit on previous albums, and again, I was listening to a lot of their earlier material, going backwards and forwards between them, and I noticed that there's some amazing high points that they hit previously that they just can't with this current lineup. I think those changes kind of hurt them a little bit in that way, and so it feels a little strained. There's some notes that they just can't quite get to anymore. Hopefully, maybe with some practice, some voice lessons or something, they'll be able to get back to where they were. But other than that, this may very well be Fleshgod Apocalypse's most accomplished album to date. It's more varied, bombastic, and technically proficient than anything they have done up until now. I give it a 10 for enjoyability, definitely a buy for me. I've already ordered it. Give it a 9 for musicianship for obvious reasons. Again, I kind of reserve that 10 slot for things that are really super technical that really make my head just spin off of my neck. So we're not quite there, but just the level of composition and the attention to detail and how much stuff they're reining in, all the time they put into it, 9 seems fair. And then I gave them an 8 for innovation too. Still pretty standard symphonic death metal, but a notable step forward for the band that seemed worth giving them that extra point. So average all of that out to a 9, A-. Again, you can get Veleno via Nuclear Blast Records on May 24th. But don't go anywhere, we've got some shout-outs for you now. First up is Austin, Texas band Glassing with their sophomore album Spotted Horse. I'd recommend Glassing to fans of Oathbreaker, Alcest, and The Drowned God. This band blends post-hardcore and post-metal with kind of more of an ambient sensibility as well, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. Like, that word just sums it up on its own, but it's a really expansive experience that conjures everything from the Moth Gatherer to Scandinavian hardcore groups like Eglise and LLNN, to also converges Jane Doe. It's a very dynamic album with lots of highs and lows and a perfect balance of raw, abrasive noise with stunning melody. I mean, just listening to opening track When You Stare is like climbing some godforsaken mountain to its icy peak. It just feels cold. I can literally almost feel the frost on my face when I'm listening to this track. Then you've got more abrasive, straightforward ones like Lobe, which is just a straight ripper, and then also wispy post-rock mood music like A Good Death. Lots of variety here, lots of different things to enjoy, a little bit something for everyone. And then there's these just tortured post-hardcore howls that punctuate all of the chaotic, sludgy chords and more shimmering kind of guitar flourishes. Another word I'd use is haunting, just very atmospheric stuff that sticks with you and really just gets under your skin. It's impressive how Glassing so seamlessly traverse both grim darkness and ethereal light in a way that is absolutely breathtaking, and that is not hyperbole. I mean it 100%. I honestly toyed with doing a full review for this one just by itself, but the more I thought about it and the more just like I've been working on so many other things, I thought realistically this is going to end up on my June podcast for the best of 2019 so far anyways. So I don't feel too bad about it, and I'm glad to share it here alongside an album that I know a lot of people are going to be interested in checking out. So hopefully they'll stick around and hear about this because you absolutely need to check it out. You can find a link again down in the description for the written review that also includes the full album stream. It is definitely worth it. Again, absolutely gorgeous stuff. It's one of those albums that really transports you places mentally and virtually shuts out all of the other bullshit when it's playing. It just demands your attention in that way. And every time I come back to it, I'm like, okay, is this finally going to be old? Like, is this going to kind of run its course? But no, like, it's almost like experiencing it new every single time. I re-listened to it again before I did this final recording, and I love it even more now than I already did when I wrote the written piece that you can check out. So definitely give it a listen. All right, next up we've got Archivist, which is a multinational group with members across Europe, and this is the third chapter of their progressive post-metal, post-black sci-fi saga, and this one's called Triumvirate. I'd recommend Archivist to fans of Underling, Numenorian, and So Hideous. And depending on how closely you follow the material here at Metal Trenches and on our YouTube channel, you may or may not be familiar with Archivist already, because we recently did a video list of post-black bands similar to Death Heaven and Numenorian that deserve your attention. But if not, this is a good time to fix that mistake, because you absolutely need to check these guys out. They are super talented. Just a little quick background on kind of the story here. It all started with their self-titled album. And the story is kind of like a Coheed and Cambria type deal, where again, it's like science fiction, and it has to do with the tribulations of the last survivor of Earth who has stowed away in an escape pod. And so they put out that self-titled. They had a follow-up called AI, which admittedly I was not as big a fan of, but still enjoyed. There were a few tracks on there that I still really loved. And now with Triumvirate, it seems like they've really stepped up the quality once more. It's kind of still early for me to tell whether I like this one better or less than the debut. That one just hit me so perfectly. But again, Triumvirate is really good. You've got a broad variety of different sounds, all kind of merged together in this very cohesive melodrama. You can definitely feel and hear the conceptual vibes flowing through the whole thing. It definitely works as a consistent whole. And I think particularly those of you who, like myself, enjoyed the new Numenorian so much will hear parallels in the post-black and progressive elements on this Archivist album. You've got everything from post-hardcore to post-metal to, again, progressive. I think my favorite track is the opener, Deus Ex Machina, and that just kicks things off on such an epic note. The composition just feels massive, and it's very emotionally gripping, and that's just kind of like I was saying with Glassing. That's another thing I like about this band, is that in addition to being really solid songwriters and really great musicians and putting out those good performances on a musical level, really above all else, this is an album that just makes you feel. It's really hard not to feel some personal connections to various feelings of sorrow and grief and also hope and happiness when listening to their albums, and this album too. It's another very dynamic album. I also pointed out the track Iteration 3 and Awfully, which really runs a range from fiery blackened vibes to a very proggy and effects-laden interlude. Lots of layers to peel away here. I'm looking forward to listening to this album more and seeing how my taste in it and my thoughts on it develop as time goes on. But ultimately, I love Archivist. I think they're delivering some very powerful music that's super gratifying and also very potent in terms of how it hits you emotionally. And once again, which has been the case of all of the albums in the series, it's available on Bandcamp at the price of your choosing. So, don't be stingy because it's well worth the price of admission, whatever you decide that is. But I think it's worth some of your hard-earned money, and you'll also be able to pick up physical copies in the near future. Don't miss it. Moving right along, we've got Finnish post-metal sludge band Mireplaner with their deeply atmospheric and powerful debut album, A Mountain of Seola Hooves. I'd recommend Mireplaner to fans of LLNN, The Lion's Daughter, and Cult of Luna. Another very atmospheric album for you that just seems to surround you and close in on you. This is in a much, I'd say, darker, more ominous kind of way. The opening track, Deadweights, really just lingers like this rising smoke over its nearly 6-minute duration until the point that you're like choking on it in the best possible way. And while I tend to get annoyed with seemingly obligatory introductory stuff on albums, it seems like every band feels like it's like you have to do it now. In this case, every moment of this album is purposeful, and it plays so well into that kind of tension-building dynamic. Like, I know I've mentioned The Shining before, but it just always reminds me of watching a movie like that, where it just wouldn't be as impactful to just jump right into Jack Torrance trying to kill everyone with an axe and all the crazy stuff going on. The reason that stuff has such an impact is because it has this slow build that gets you to the point where you're ready for the release. You all might be getting sick of Twin Peaks references, but I could hear the log lady in my head while I was listening to this album, and that famous line she has in Firewalk with Me, "When this kind of fire starts, it's very hard to put out." I think that's just a perfect summation of what it's like to especially hear the beginning of this album and see how the fire does just build and build completely out of control through its duration. But you do get varying levels of heat and intensity from it. It's a real blaze of sludgy guitars and just howling vocals that are all-consuming. Definitely getting those The Lion's Daughter vibes from that in particular. This really does remind me a lot of The Lion's Daughter's previous album, not the more kind of 80s horror-influenced one that came out, I think, last year, but the one that came out before that, Existence is Horror. And again, I'm praising very dynamic albums because you've got that, and then again, you've got those slower builds, and also it kind of dies down to embers for a little while on the more post-metal moments on tracks like Morass, which sort of lulls you into this false sense of security. And even though this is a really long track, it's super engaging. They've got these perfectly punctuated transitions that ultimately lead up to the delicious dessert that is the groovy closing riff. These guys are very strong songwriters, and on top of that, the production of this album is every bit as impressive as a major label release, but with only a tiny fraction of that support. I really ultimately have nothing negative to say about this album. Again, if you really liked The Lion's Daughter, also you dig things like Primitive Man, maybe Lord Mantis, you absolutely need to buy this album. All right, then we've got London area metallic hardcore in the form of Employed to Serve. This is their sophomore album, Eternal Forward Motion, via Spine Farm Records. I'd recommend Employed to Serve to fans of Vane, Harm's Way, and Code Orange. Yes, again, another one of those bands. God knows Flight has a soft spot for these intensely metallic hardcore bands that just keep coming out of the woodwork, and it still hasn't gotten old for me. Eventually it will, I'm sure. Everything has a bubble that bursts, but for now, I'm really enjoying this sound, and I'm just eating up every band that has been coming into it. And honestly, it's impressive too, because a lot of these like genre niches have like a few really good bands and then like a lot of crap that just sort of lingers on the fringes and maybe has like one good song. Like when I'm thinking back on like the new metal craze, there are new metal bands that I still really like and still enjoy listening to, but the vast majority of it was crap. And for some reason with this really intense, a little bit electronified and super modern, punchy metallic hardcore, there's just a lot of really amazing groups that are pretty much equally good, and Employed to Serve are another one of those bands. These guys are super aggressive, type of music that you can definitely listen to at the gym while you're lifting weights, in addition to plenty of other settings too if that's not your bag. Very adrenaline inducing. Again, very similar energy to that kind of Harm's Way. That I know there's a lot of Harm's Way memes about getting like big and beefy and like joking about what people who listen to Harm's Way look like, but I love that stuff, man. Like, I love something that can give me that shot of, it's like a steroid injection without having to screw up your body with junk and chemicals. And again, there's certain tracks that directly parallel Code Orange's style. I'm particularly thinking about Force Fed and Dull Ache Behind the Ears, but there are a few others as well. Lots of great transitions here too. You got to move from like balls to the wall, grindcore basically, to more of like beatdown breakdowns. I'm picturing some catastrophic mosh pits with this album. And again, you get a decent amount of variety too, because the one trap that these albums can fall into is it becomes very one note, but not really so much with this group. Like, you got some different pacing, some different styles. Again, you've got the more like straightforward grindcore, really aggressive, noisy tracks. Then you've got sort of larger scale melodic tinge tracks that have a little bit more emotional weight, like Bare Bones and We Forgot You. And then also like stark minimalism. Like, I really love the track Harsh Truth because it just like boils it down to basically the vocals, the bass, a little bit of guitar, and the drums. Like, it's a very just kind of vocally straightforward driven track. And vocalist Justine Jones is really captivating with her just ferocious growls. It's just sort of a no-nonsense, no frills, no bullshit, straightforward hardcore scream, and I'm a little bit scared of her. She will fuck up your world, like, no question. Don't mess with her. So yeah, just a really decimating album with some decently diverse songwriting too, which helps it stand out. Definitely required listening for hardcore fans in 2019. If you love any of the groups that I've mentioned before, then you're probably going to devour this whole. All right, and I can't end this thing without mentioning Colorado blackened technical death metal band Vale of Pnath with their new album Accursed via Willowtip Records. I'd recommend these guys to fans of the Black Dahlia Murder, Alter Beast, and the Zenith Passage. Now, this is being put out there and advertised as an EP, but at just under 30 minutes, like really close to that mark, it actually feels like the perfect length for an album like this. In fact, I get kind of annoyed now when albums are overlong, more so than when they feel too short. Like, it's actually kind of rare that I complain an album is too short, where it's quite frequent that things can start to feel bloated when they go on. So 30 minutes, it's a pretty good length to get your jam on. So you can get in, get out, and it just leaves you with that maximum wake of destruction. I described Accursed as like a precision military raid, really, in that way. And the tracks just get better and better, kind of the deeper you dive into it. The title track is, in particular, a total barn burner, probably my favorite on the album. I also like the piano-infused closer, Spectre of Bone. And if you're not familiar with Vale of Pnath's sound, kind of picture a Venn diagram with 3 overlapping circles. And one circle's tech death, another circle's melodic death metal, and another circle's blackened death metal. So the Black Dahlia Murder on this diagram, I'd say, sits pretty comfortably right in the middle of this chart. But if you kind of just take them and drag them a little bit further along the axis between tech death and black metal, you more or less end up with Vale of Pnath. You've got those same catchy, high-energy melodic death metal hooks, but with a little more technicality and very black metal-sounding vocals. And the kind of sparing, subtle use of atmospheric synths is a nice touch as well on tracks like The Darkest Gate. Even getting some really mild, like Dimmu Borgir vibes with those. I do have some complaints in that this is just still kind of stuff you've heard before. Like, it sounds very familiar to me, but it's done really well. It's very enjoyable. I really like this band, and it's definitely worth your time, especially if you just love this kind of music. If you've been following all of our interviews and reviews of like stuff from the Artisan era recently, this fits right in with that crowd. And yeah, if you like that stuff, definitely pick this one up. Super heavy, very technical, fast, fun. And that's it for this episode of Trench Talk. Once more, please do subscribe if you haven't already. Please do hit that like button if you enjoyed what you heard. If you're listening on other platforms, give us a review or a rating or a comment. I read every one of them. Follow us on social media. We're on all platforms. Check us out on Bandcamp. And of course, if you want to take that extra step, if you enjoy the content enough and continue coming back and feel like you're actually getting some added value, you're walking away with new information, new bands, new albums that you might not have otherwise known about, then consider hopping over to our Patreon and supporting us there. Links to all this down in the description. But now it's time for me to sign off. I will see you in the trenches.